I said, because if I do die, I'm gonna ask the Lord, let me haunt you.
We so often hear about those that don't make it out of danger alive. But what about those that do?
My body got warm and just said, get up. You're not done, get up.
I'm Caitlin Van Mall, back with a brand new season of I Survived.
The more I begged him, the happier and the more excited he got.
Join me for new episodes of I Survived every Monday, and subscribe now wherever you listen to podcasts.
This episode of The Prosecutors is brought to you by Huggies Little Movers. You get your baby's butt into Huggies Little Movers. We got you, baby. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are The Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, murder is depressingly common, but a killer clown? Who killed Marlene Warren? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my emphatic co-host, Alice.
Emphatic.
Emphatic.
I don't know why that is the descriptor, but thank you. I guess I am emphatic. I guess no one has ever accused me of not saying what I believe.
Well, that is definitely true. I could have called you, calorophobic, which I guess means afraid of clowns. That would have worked too.
That would have been appropriate because who isn't afraid of clowns? I was saying before we started recording, well, maybe we were recording, there's just like no good use of clowns. I think we should ban clowns because every time a clown's involved, something terrible happens. So yes, I am afraid of clowns.
Isn't that kind of sad? Like if you were a clown, you dedicated your life to making kids happy, you know, and then you have all these, you have It by Stephen King, you have John Wayne Gacy, of course, who liked to dress up like a clown and was a serial killer. I mean, it's rough. Killer Clowns from Outer Space, great movie if you haven't seen it. It's rough being a clown these days. It's hard to be anything other than creepy.
This is all true.
And this story isn't going to make it any better. I mean, this is one of the most shocking and absurd in a lot of ways, and just daring and unbelievable stories that we've seen in a long time. It's amazing the lengths some people will go to commit a murder, and it's also amazing how hard sometimes it can be to solve a crime when it seems like the person who is responsible is so obvious. But that's where we are here in this case, the murder of Marlene Warren. Alice, unless you have more thoughts on clowns, I'm ready to dive into the story if you are.
You go for it.
Well, this is going to take us all the way back to 1990. Bizarrely, though, it will lead us right up to the present day, to Wellington, Florida, because, you know, I love Florida. People often say that the panhandle of Florida is basically lower Alabama. It truly is. But man, if you're going to have a crazy story with a lot of weird twists and turns, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be Florida. It just is. It's kind of strange. You would think it would be spread out a little bit more, but for some reason, Florida just draws the very best and the very weirdest. And this is a strange case. So Marlene Warren was beloved by many before her shocking death at the age of only 40 years old. Marlene was born and raised in Michigan and described as friendly, loving, kind, and courteous. She loved to bake and to paint. In particular, she liked painting clowns. Yes, you heard that correctly, because there was a time when people still liked clowns. As a matter of fact, as an aside, while we're talking about this, my wife, when she was a little girl, I don't know, collected clowns is the right word, but in her room to this day, they're just all these clowns, like clown dolls and stuff. And it's pretty creepy, I admit. But like I said, I don't think clowns are always viewed with the level of fear as they are now. And
I'm sorry, we just have to stop for one moment because I think all of us agree who've been listening to this podcast for years that the hero of the Prosecutor's Podcast is Mrs. Brett. But that is the weirdest thing I've ever heard any child do.
lover of clowns, apparently. We've never really talked about it.
We've never talked about this, and I count Mrs. Brett one of my best friends and people I respect most, but I did not know this incredibly creepy fact about her.
I'm sure we'll end up talking about this after this episode. She's probably watching right now as we record it. So, she's going to be like, it wasn't clowns. It was just these dolls that happen to look just like clowns. I mean, they're
dolls
definitely
with a lot
clowns.
of makeup on.
Yeah, exactly. And that look clown.
I'm sorry. Not to call out Mrs. Brett. I just have to say whatever was on everybody's mind, which is that's creepy.
Anyway, so much like Mrs. Brett, Marlene loved clowns. Marlene transitioned to life as a wife and mom at a relatively young age. Her and her husband, John, welcomed her first child, John Aarons Jr., when Marlene was only 15 years old. A couple years later, the pair went on to welcome a second son, Joey. But soon after, tragedy struck when John Aarons Sr. was killed in a car accident. A few years later, though, Marlene found love again when she met Michael Warren. She and Michael got married when she was 22 and he was 19 and moved to Florida. Everybody involved in this story is just so young, and that's a lot of tragedy to go through at such a young age, especially a mom with 2 kids.
This doesn't start off or end like most stories because it could have easily been a very young teen mother who then everything goes awry because she has children so young, it's hard to provide for them. But rather, they're making it work. And it, like some of the stories we've covered, it's like this tragedy after tragedy, and it's going to end in more tragedy than you can even imagine. It just seems so unfair because they've beat the odds. They had children young, but it seemed like a healthy, loving relationship, and then life strikes in the most terrible way.
And as a matter of fact, I mean, they really get it together. Michael gets a job as a meat inspector. They begin investing in real estate. Marlene is managing this growing portfolio of rental properties that the couple owned. And they're finding all the success in real estate. And soon, Michael is able to quit his job. And he opens up another business, a used car business known as Budget Motors. And this is just an amazing life that I'm sure Marlene, when she was living through that tragedy, she loses her husband at such a young age. She probably never could have imagined anything like this, but they have so much success that they're able to purchase a home in the Aero Club, which is a wealthy private community in prestigious Wellington, Florida, where members even had access to a private airstrip. And I feel like, once again, if we were in Dateline, this would be the moment where someone would say, the kind of place that nothing tragic ever happens.
You're right, Brett. Marlene thrived both personally and professionally in Wellington, but Mike, who is described as rough around the edges, had a difficult time fitting into this upscale lifestyle. He was arrested in 1983 for odometer tampering at his used car lot and sentenced to 18 months probation. One thing I want to note about this odometer kind of tampering, so technically, this is, I think, like when we do prosecutions, I think it's technically classified as a white-collar crime, right? It's not a violent crime. You don't use a weapon. It's kind of, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, like, who's hurt, right? It's a crime of fraud. But what I've noticed in these types of fraudulent cases, so it's not like wire fraud, not these like big sophisticated Ponzi scheme cases where you're getting billions or millions of dollars from the government or people. Kind of these low level fraud cases I find seem to be very intertwined with violence as well. And I think you'll begin to see this. So while it may seem like, oh, what's the big deal? He's tampering with odometers. You see this kind of getting your way through low means and not trying to do these things to necessarily even get rich, but this is kind of your outlook on life. Everything can be cheated for your own gain, even these small things, because odometer tampering doesn't take that much. Guess what? You also don't make that much on it, right? So you're not making massive amounts of money. And so this way of viewing life, you're going to see kind of take fruit in really tragic ways. And as if Marlene didn't suffer enough with kind of, she's holding it together. She seems to be flourishing. She is married to someone who is getting in trouble with the law. She has lost her first husband. In 1988, tragedy struck again when Marlene's oldest son, John Jr., died in a car accident at only 22 years old. The grief of losing a child caused added stress on the Warrens' already struggling marriage. Those of you who've studied psychology or, God forbid, have gone through something like this know there's really almost no greater stressor on any family than losing a child. Now, Mike and Marlene were living virtually separate lives. Marlene was focused on running the rental properties while Mike focused on running Budget Motors. It was there that Mike met 27-year-old Sheila Keene. She was the wife of one of his tow truck drivers. And the two were described as having an instant connection, and they began an affair, although both of them denied it, seeing as they were both still married. In the spring of 1990, the Warren family's life would turn upside down yet again, but this time not because of some accident, rather because of a murder.
Okay, let's turn to the timeline. May 24th, 1990. Two women who worked at Capezio Costume Shop recalled a woman coming in just as the store was closing, and she was looking to purchase a clown costume. Now, the ladies asked her to return the next day when the store was open. I mean, they were basically trying to get out of there. You know how it is if you ever worked in retail or worked in a restaurant and somebody walks in 2 minutes before the store closes. Technically, you have to serve them, but you kind of want them to leave because you're ready to close up and go. But she pleaded with them, begged them for this clown costume, telling them that she needed it that night. And they took pity on her and agreed. And the woman purchased a clown costume, a wig, and extra white makeup. The employees would later describe the woman as around 5 feet 8 inches with brown eyes and long chocolate brown hair. And I won't spoil it for you, but they will eventually identify the person who purchased the costume in a photo lineup.
So a couple days later, May 26, 1990, at about 9:15 a.m., and again, this wouldn't be discovered until later in the investigation, but we now know this, law enforcement is able to determine that the specific Mylar balloons found at the crime scene were purchased at a Publix near Sheila's work. Publix, if you don't have them around you, it's just a grocery store, a pretty big chain. Employees at the store remembered someone coming in to buy these balloons, and they described the person who purchased the balloons as a woman with long brown hair, which matched Sheila's description.
And remember, Sheila just so happens to be the person that Marlene's husband is having an affair with. So this takes us to 10:45 a.m. Marlene is making breakfast for her son and some of his friends at their home in Wellington, Florida. She hears a knock at the door, and when she looks out the window, she sees a clown standing there with a basket of flowers and 2 balloons. And remember, Marlene loves clowns. She would paint clowns. She opens the door and exclaims, "Oh, how nice." But as soon as the words were out of her mouth, the clown dropped the gifts and pulled out a gun, shooting Marlene in the face. Now remember, her son's there. Her son's friends are there. Her 21-year-old son, Joey, he gets a quick glance at the clown and can only identify that whoever this was had brown eyes and big hands. And this initial description of big hands will lead investigators to believe that they are looking for a man, which, once again, we talk about this all the time. Eyewitness, you just never know. I mean, maybe the person did have big hands, or maybe just for whatever reason that the hands in this person's memory became just bigger than they actually were. And so when he's attempting to tell the story, and he's doing the very best he can, he gives this detail, which may not be completely accurate. And police, it's important. Use the information you get from eyewitnesses, but make sure that it doesn't give you tunnel vision so that you ignore the possibility that what you're hearing isn't correct.
And imagine the shock factor. We know this whenever there's chaos, your brain tries to make sense of the chaos by focusing in on something. We know that hands pulled the trigger. You can imagine that there's just utter shock where her son sees it happening almost in slow-mo, and his eyes, because his brain is trying to process all the chaos that's happening, focuses in on like the center of the chaos, which is someone pulling the gun, where in your mind, we've talked about how the brain really fills in these gaps. The hands are giant, right? Because they're doing this impossible thing that utterly changes your entire life. This is important to note because this is why we question everything. A lot of people hate lawyers because we ask questions about everything. When you tell me a story, I'm not a very fun person to tell a story to because I'm like, but how do you know that? Like, what makes you say that the hands are big? This is exactly why we ask those follow-up questions, because it could be that the hands are what stuck out to you, but it may not even be the largeness. But the fact that you remember it after the fact may make you think, well, maybe I keep thinking about them because there was something extraordinary about them. Maybe it was the size. Well, they weren't super small, so maybe they were large. Clowns typically have large feet and large hands, like as part of their costume. So you see how the brain kind of fills in all these gaps. It's worthy of noting because of exactly what Brett just said in terms of eyewitness accounts, how faulty they can be, and how it can really shape an entire investigation from the get-go.
And it's hard to overstate how shocking this entire situation must have been. Just, you would almost feel like your brain was breaking seeing it happen. This clown, I mean, someone dressed as a clown showing up at your front door and then pulling out a gun and shooting your mother and then running off and jumping into a white Chevrolet LeBaron. I mean, the whole thing is so absurd. It just doesn't feel like this can be real life. It doesn't feel like this is some sort of bizarre nightmare you're going to wake up from. And so getting the details right, even though you really want to, because you want the police to be able to find whoever did this to your mom, would just be so difficult. And yet that's what you're tasked with doing while your mom is laying there fighting for her life and you're trying to remember small details that maybe can help the police figure out who the clown was who just shot your mom. I mean, just think about that sentence and how utterly mind-breaking it is to even imagine that this actually happened to somebody. So a neighbor, Bill Kramer, was outside walking his dog when a couple of young men came running out of Marlene's house, yelling that Joey's mother had been shot. So his wife ends up calling the police, and Marlene is rushed to a nearby hospital. During the time of the murder, Marlene's husband, Michael Warren, was confirmed to be with friends on the way to a nearby racetrack. So he has a rock-solid alibi for when this happens.
And let's just take a couple steps back for what we now know, which is that the person who bought the clown costume was insistent that they had the clown costume, meaning this was all part of the ploy, and how just incredibly devious it is, right? When we first started looking at this case, before I knew the whole plot of what happened, I literally turned to Brett and was like, what, they just like showed up like a clownogram and someone's like, oh, someone sent me a clown and opened the door and shot him in the face? And he was like, exactly. Right? Like, it is so devious because if I saw a FedEx person at my front door, if I saw a clown delivering balloons, of course I would open the door. Why would I even begin to think that someone was going to take out a gun, shoot me in broad daylight at my front door when they are dressed as creepy as clowns are, as a clown?
And remember, this is somebody who would have known that Marlene isn't going to see clowns as creepy. Like, if a clown knocks on my front door, I mean, maybe my wife would open the front door because we now know that she likes clowns. But I would be cautious about the clown. But whoever did this knew this was something that would put her at ease. You know, it reminds me kind of the Liz Barraza story that we talked about, where she's setting up the garage sale, and it seemed like whoever did it had to know that that was going to happen, and it narrowed the scope of the people it could be, even though they have not been able to figure out who did it, because she would not have been on edge seeing someone approach her because they're coming to look at the garage sale. They must know about the garage sale. Same thing here. There's no reason that Marlene would be on edge seeing a clown at her front door because anyone who knew her would know that would be the kind of surprise that she would get a kick out of.
Can we also talk about the boldness of it? If this person knew her well enough to know that clowns would not put her on edge, may not specifically had known that there would be other people in the house, but her son lived there. And obviously she was preparing breakfast for not just him, but also the friends. So to do this with the knowledge that others are there, pretty much grown men too, right? Like, they're young adults, but they aren't small children. So people who could potentially be protective, which is why I think it was such an immediate thing. As soon as she opened the door, the gun was pulled rather than some sort of struggle, because there was no time for anyone to be able to help her. But to do it with the knowledge that very likely there'd be witnesses and there'd be able-bodied people who could seek help quickly is just mind-blowing, the boldness of this plan. Now, 2 days after the attack on May 28th, 1990, Marlene sadly is removed from life support and she passes away. The shot, such close range to her face, was just not something she could survive. She was only 40 years old. On May 30th, 1990, the white Chevrolet LeBaron that was driven during the attack was found in a parking lot of a Winn-Dixie, another grocery store, and it was only 8 miles from the crime scene. The police investigators got inside the vehicle and they found orange curly fibers, which appear to be from a clown wig, and also long brown human hair. Obviously, this is just a judgment, but long indicates maybe a woman rather than a man. Remember how originally from the eyewitness account from Joey, they were looking for a man at first because of the large hand description. So this is an interesting find because of that brown hair mixed in with the wig fibers. Now, that same day, investigators obtain a search warrant to search Sheila Keene's apartment. You see that she's immediately on their radar. Orange fibers were found on clothing inside of her apartment, which seemed to match the fibers from a clown wig. Doesn't this all seem to be like, oh, we're connecting the dots really quickly? This is just days after the murder. Later in the investigation, police discovered some interesting information about the LeBaron. According to Court TV, a couple rented a white LeBaron from Payless Cars, which is a car lot near Budget Motors. Remember Budget Motors? That's where Marlene's husband ran his business. When it was time to return the vehicle, they looked up Payless Cars in the phone book to call and ask for instructions on the return process. They found an advertisement for Michael Warren's company, Budget Motors, and due to confusing advertising, mistakenly thought that Budget Motors was Payless Cars. So they called the number on the Budget Motors ad, and someone at Budget Motors told the pair to just leave the car outside of the gate with the keys under the windshield wipers. The couple obliged, assuming they had returned the car where it belonged. The car was reported stolen by Payless Cars. So that was a little bit confusing. Let me just step back real quick. Someone rented this car that was seen leaving the scene of Marlene's shooting. And because this is back in the early 90s when we used phone books and there wasn't just like Google to open up and tell you how to return cars, this couple who rented the car wanted to know how to return the car, but they called the wrong number. And they actually called Mike's business, Budget Motors. And whoever they talked to at Budget Motors was like, don't worry about it. Leave the car outside this gate and leave the keys. We're good to go. They didn't return the car, is the whole point. So there was a car that was just out there rented in someone else's name.
Guys, we want to talk about a podcast that needs no introduction because it's one that we've appeared on several times, and we love Silver Linings Handbook. We love Jason Blair. We love the work that he does. He is one of the best interviewers in the business. He has interviewed a lot of people from both the true crime space and really across the spectrum, and he always manages to get the very best points out of them. He talks about he wants to do a podcast with conversations that inspire, and that's what he does every single episode. I hope you guys will check it out. It is amazing. We love not only appearing on it, but we love listening to it, and you will too.
Absolutely. You will get so much out of his very interesting conversations with interesting people. The areas he's focused on have included well-being, mental health, the law and criminal justice system, true crime, religion, society, culture, people who are underrepresented in the mainstream media, such as racial minorities, indigenous people, and LGBTQ people. In other words, there is something for everyone. And what we feel makes this podcast different is that it's truly not scripted. We can say that having appeared on it before, because Jason uses the same natural curiosity you have listening in your living room or around a campfire with a new and exciting person you have just met. Jason's a former journalist who worked at the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and other newspapers. And the podcast is one of several comebacks from a 2003 scandal that he was part of at the Times that led him to start working in mental health. And his vulnerability around this has been so refreshing that we can all learn from. So subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Guys, we probably all remember the first time we got on the internet. Now, for some of you, that was when you were like 3. But for a lot of us, we remember. We remember the noise, the dial-up, that screeching sound that happened every time you loaded, and you didn't really know what you were going to find. And I got to tell you, it was a lot more dangerous than we would have thought. I think looking back on it, if my parents had known what all you could do on the internet, they probably never would have let me get on it. And I got to tell you, as a parent now, I am terrified of the internet, which is why I want to tell you about this lifesaver for both parents and children, Gab. Gab is the leader in safe smartphones and watches for kids, teens, and tweens. With no social media apps, no internet browser, and GPS tracking, Gab devices were built from the ground up specifically for kids and teens and are the way to keep your kids safely connected. And Gab phones and watches are still tech kids actually want. There's unlimited talk and text, a clean music streaming app, and over 100 third-party apps that can be installed at parents' discretion.
And guys, Gab is truly just such a wonderful way to stay connected with your kids. So my niece is getting older now, but she's not even yet a teenager. She's involved in cheerleading, which means traveling to games and getting on buses. I want to know where she is because I'm in charge of picking her up sometimes, but I don't want to hand her a device that could be a portal into online predators, which is why I'm so glad that Gab phones are an option for her. She can talk and text with me. I can get to her whenever her practices wrap up, and there's even clean music streaming apps, but I know that she is protected from the World Wide Web full of predators. That's why I really think Gab is a game changer, and I can't recommend enough that you give it a try. This is the absolute best time to check them out because right now Gab is offering $25 off any device to new customers with no contract required. That's $25 off any Gab smartphone or smartwatch. Just go to gab.com/prosecutors. That's where you'll get the best deal. That's Gab, GABB.com/prosecutors. Gab.com/prosecutors.
And we're going to put this image of the ad. If you're watching on YouTube, you've probably seen it, but I'm going to put this image of the ad on the website if you want to check it out, and you'll see the problem because even though the name of the company is Budget Motors, in their advertisement, in the middle, it says pay less. So this couple, they're flipping through the yellow pages, which I realize for some of you out there, you're like, what in the world are you talking about? They're flipping through the yellow pages. They're looking at the auto rental section, and they see this ad, and it says pay less in the middle, which, you know, I mean, this is basically a copyright violation by Budget, because they're obviously trying to do exactly this to confuse people who are looking for Payless. And when they see that, they think, oh, I'll be able to return this car. Now, here's what's really interesting about all this. Remember the woman and how urgent it was that she get that clown costume. And you may be thinking, what was it about that day? Why did she need it that day? I think this answers the question. She had a getaway car. You know, a getaway car is hard to get because if you go rent a car, there's going to be a record of it. If you use your own car, someone might see it. Stealing a car is not as easy as you might think. But this car just drops into the killer's lap, who I'm going to assume is connected to Budget Auto, and who obviously the police assume was connected to Budget as well. It's pretty clear the police, it didn't take them long. And, you know, people out there, if you're having an affair at work, everybody knows about it. Don't think you're keeping a secret. You're not. It didn't take the police very long to realize this was the situation and to realize who had a potential reason to do something like this and to start tying that clown costume back to this couple who included her husband and Sheila. And once they do that, they start circling in on all this, and you start to see how this could have come together.
And this is crazy because you begin to see just how planned this is. Take a look at this ad. Budget Motors, I can't see it anywhere on this ad. The name of their company. And when you're thinking about like pay less as a motto, like pay less for your cars, how do you spell it? Pay space less, right? It's two different words. The name of the rental company is Payless with no space in between. This ad also has no space in between when they're not supposed to be saying that their name is Payless because their name is Budget Motors. They are essentially ripping off Payless business by saying you can pay less, quote unquote, without the space in between. Like, this is incredibly intentional when you start looking at it. The whole point is to be confused. And I think you're exactly right that she goes to Capizio that day needing a costume because she's like, got a car. Someone called, they're going to drop off a car tonight or tomorrow, whatever the due date is. So I have to have the costume in time for when the car's here because I'm going to grab the keys, jump in the car, commit the murder, drop off the car 8 miles away. No one's going to know any better. Well, like you said, Brett, it's hard to keep your personal life under wraps. And around this same time, this like couple days after Marlene's murder, one of Mike's employees, Richard Keene, you may know that last name, Sheila Keene's husband, who was a tow truck driver for Mike's business, reported to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department that Mike Warren and his now estranged wife Sheila Keene were having an affair. And because he makes that call, that's how the police begin to circle in on Sheila, and that's why she becomes a person of interest and they get the search warrant to search her car, not to mention the long brown hair that they find in this car that's been reported stolen, but was seen leaving the crime scene after Marlene was shot. Now, you all may be thinking, well, bingo. We got the hair, we got sightings, we have, an ex-husband telling people about, you have motive here, you have like an ad, you have a reported car stolen that's found abandoned. This is all great. Make an arrest. We know exactly who did it. Despite all this, the little evidence tying Sheila to the crime, the case actually grows cold and nothing happens. No arrest, no justice for Marlene.
This is a good lesson for everybody out there because there are a lot of cases that are unsolved, quote unquote unsolved, where there's been no arrest, where the police feel pretty confident who did it. And they've got this kind of evidence pointing directly at someone, but they don't feel like they have enough to make the arrest. To take that additional step, because you could probably get an arrest warrant with this because all you need is probable cause. And this is pretty good probable cause to think that she's involved. You got the orange hairs, the description of her from the people who work at the store, the place where she bought the balloons. All of this connects to her. This is pretty good, but is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Are you sitting out there right now in the world? Would that be enough for you? If that's what you had, some orange fibers that appear to be the same kind of fibers that would be in a clown wig and some brown hair, is that enough for you? And an affair, is that enough for you to say guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? And the police and the prosecutors, as we've said before, the job is to gather enough evidence to convince a jury, but you have to be that gatekeeper. And I think it's pretty clear that here they knew that wasn't enough. They knew that didn't reach beyond a reasonable doubt. And so they're waiting for one more piece of evidence to break the case open, a witness, some more physical evidence, something that cinches it all together and allows them to bring charges. Unfortunately, it's going to be a while before that happens. Fast forward to 1994. So during the investigation, police do begin to look into Mike Warren's business. That's the thing. Once you bring police attention down on you, all of a sudden, they begin to find things. In 1994, he was convicted of grand theft, racketeering, and odometer tampering, back to his old ways. And he would serve almost 4 years in prison as a result. But when he gets out of prison, he continues right with this great love story with Sheila. And in 2002, Mike and Sheila are married, and they moved to Tennessee where they purchased a fast food restaurant called The Purple Cow, which makes me mad because I love the name of that restaurant, and it irritates me that these two get to have such a cool named restaurant. And Sheila actually changes her name. She's no longer Sheila. She's now going by Debbie Warren.
Which is not a nickname for those of you who may not be from the U.S. Debbie is not a nickname for Sheila. It seems pretty clear she's totally changing her identity.
Absolutely. So in 2004, Mike and Sheila, a.k.a. Debbie, buy a lake house in wealthy Abingdon, Virginia, and settle into the community. Sheila was generally well liked by her neighbors, who obviously had no idea what sort of crime she may have been involved in the past. But several people still had a problem with Mike. Remember, Mike never really fit into the last wealthy neighborhood that he lived in. He was rough around the edges. He was involved in these kind of frauds. And as Alice said, you guys would be surprised. There are just a certain subset of crimes that appear to be nonviolent, white-collar-ish types of crimes that really are connected to sort of the criminal underworld.
One example that just always pops to my mind is this is a fictional character, but the father from Matilda, the movie and book by Roald Dahl, where she's not an orphan, but her parents essentially are terrible parents, and she eventually gets adopted by Miss Honey, her teacher. Her father, if you remember, who's played by Danny DeVito in the movie version, you can also read the book. He's a used car salesman who regularly does odometer tampering, right? Like that's the thing he teaches all his kids to do. And Matilda, I think, gets in trouble because she thinks that's wrong, like morally, and she doesn't want to do it. And so as a result, her parents are like, you're not one of us. Like, this is just how the world works. We turn back odometers, we make money. It's no big deal. Obviously, the story kind of paints this fictional character as this very unsavory man who is the kind of man who would essentially kick his own flesh and blood to the streets, even though she's not an orphan, treat her essentially like an orphan. And he does other kind of just bad things in his life. I don't think he's ever violent, like a murderer in the stories, but that character is a prototype for a reason, right? Like a stereotype for a reason, because of the type of crime that you often see lead to a certain type of character. And I think when I think of Mike, I kind of think of that character that Danny DeVito plays in Matilda. So in 2013, and kudos to law enforcement for not giving up on this, because now we're talking 23 years after the murder, a cold case unit reopens Marlene's case due to advances in DNA testing. This is what we say about DNA. There are leaps and bounds, every year. And so if there's DNA left behind, use it only when you are sure you can get something from it, because DNA is consumed whenever it's tested. And it gets sent off for kind of this specialized DNA testing that didn't exist 23 years earlier. And fast forward a few more years, still nothing really happens in terms of justice for Marlene. In 2017, Marlene and Mike, who have operated the Purple Cow for quite some time now, sell it, and they begin a charmed, retired life. Then on September 26, 2017, 27 years after Marlene's murder, finally an arrest is made. On September 26, 2017, Sheila Keene was arrested for first-degree murder. The DNA evidence, which took 3 years to test, had come back. And it showed that the tests were an identical match on orange hairs inside the LeBaron and those found in Sheila's apartment. They also found matches between her hair and hair found in that LeBaron car that was abandoned 8 miles away from the crime scene. All these things they had at the time, remember? But we can't just go off of eyesight. Like, a lot of people have brown hair. Orange wig is a little bit weird, but who knows? Maybe people have costumes around. But now that we have DNA testing and we can definitively tie not only her hair to the hair found in that abandoned car that she wasn't supposed to be in. Remember, she didn't rent the car. So why is her hair in that car that was reported stolen? And then this orange wig, the orange fibers are the same as what's in the car with her hair that we now know because of DNA testing is her hair, also in her apartment. Now you have that beyond a reasonable doubt probable cause in order to make an arrest. In October, Sheila was no longer, of course, living in Florida at the time. Remember, she had retired, was living elsewhere. She was extradited to Florida and booked into the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office jail. And she spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial. Now, initially, the state was going to pursue the death penalty, but in the course of their prosecution, they changed their mind. And Sheila was set to go to trial in May of 2023. That's a very long time.
But unfortunately, she would not go to trial. This is one of those cases that just sort of demonstrates the limitations of the justice system because it can only do so much. And in April of 2023, just before that trial was supposed to start, Sheila pled guilty to second-degree murder. It was part of an unexpected plea deal. I mean, remember, at the time the state made the arrest, they were going to look for the death penalty. And now all of a sudden, they're letting her plead guilty to second-degree murder. And this was the result of some issues with how the evidence was stored, which the defense was going to hammer on. I mean, basically, you can imagine how this argument was going to go. The evidence was contaminated. How can you trust the DNA results? You know, it's probably some sort of accident that this DNA even connected to her. Somehow it was tainted in a way that would lead to this false positive, basically, is what the defense was going to say. And look, that was the evidence that the state had. The state had some good circumstantial evidence about the relationship between Sheila and Mike, which confirmed, by the way. I mean, given that they have been together ever since, they had that. They had some eyewitness accounts that seemed to match her But really, it's the DNA that's going to cinch it.
And remember those eyewitness accounts? They probably, when they figured out who it was later on, were having these eyewitnesses testify like 27 years later. That's really hard. This is why whenever we do a case where it seems like we just need one more, witness or one more piece of information to tie things together, we're like, tell it now. Because 27 years later, man, that cross-examination is going to be rough on the Publix employee. Yeah, the Publix employee may really remember Sheila Keene, but she's probably not going to be able to point out Sheila Keene 27 years later sitting in the room who's been going by Debbie for the last 20 years. And when asked on cross-examination, really? You worked at the Publix? How many customers did you see a day? Okay. On average, 150. You worked there for how many days? How many years? How long ago was this? And you're saying right now, 27 years later, after seeing 10,382 customers, you remember Sheila Keene buying some balloons from your Publix. How long have you been meeting with prosecutors? That's just devastating. Doesn't matter how good that eyewitness is, right? And so all you have is the DNA. And if that's going to be at all weak, you can see how this is not going to be a slam dunk trial.
And you want to get, after all this time, you want to get some amount of justice. You don't want her walking free. You want her at least to be convicted. And so she was, but she was only sentenced to 12 years in prison, which will include that time served, the 6 years that she had been waiting to go to trial since she was arrested. And because, it's a state sentence, state sentences don't tend to be day for day. The truth in sentencing is sort of rare in states. Some states have it, but not all do. So she gets 12 years. But she's expected to be released in 2025. So as we record this right now, it's August 2024. She's going to be out in a matter of months for this murder. And although she pleads guilty, she maintains her innocence. Liar. And Mike has never been charged in connection to his wife's death, though I'll go out on a limb and say Mike was definitely involved in this crime. I think if you look at how this all came together, it's difficult to imagine that she could have pulled this off on her own. That without knowledge and information from Mike about her habits, when she would be there, when Marlene would be there, the fact that Marlene loved clowns, the whole thing about the car, all this just ties together that this was something that when the opportunity came, they were going to strike. And the opportunity came when that car was dropped off. And they had a very short period of time before it was going to be reported stolen by the real Payless Motor Company. And so they had to move at that point, and that's why it happened when it did. I find it very hard to believe that Mike isn't involved. But unfortunately, the only way you could ever convict Mike is if Sheila was willing to testify. And now you have nothing over Sheila because you made the deal at 12 years. I'm sure, and I'm not being critical of the state and the state prosecutors at all in this case. I'm sure they probably tried that at first. They probably said, look, we're going for the death penalty. You need to tell us what happened. You need to tell us if Mike was involved. If Mike's behind this, tell us and we'll, take the death penalty off the table or whatever. She wouldn't do it. It was largely a bluff. They knew they had these problems. And they ended up having to make this deal, which is very unsatisfying for everybody and certainly isn't complete justice for Marlene, though at least it's not one of those cases where the DNA comes back and the person who did it, died warm in their bed at 95 years old after living a great life. There is at least the fact that Sheila will forever be known as a murderer. No more going back to the nice, wealthy suburb and drinking tea with the ladies. Everybody's going to view you as a murderer. And frankly, they're going to view your husband as a murderer as well, even if he was never convicted. So that is where this case stands. And as I said, Sheila is still in prison as we record this, but unfortunately, probably not for much longer. Some say financial crime is victimless, but that definitely isn't the case, especially when it ends in murder. You need to check out Money Crimes, a new show hosted by best-selling author and entrepreneur Nicole Lapin. Money Crimes is about the world's biggest financial scandals and how they can spiral out of control in ways you'd never expect. From cunning Ponzi schemes to cutthroat politics and even murderous con artists, you'll learn that the finance world is more dangerous than you ever imagined, and most importantly, how to protect yourself from it.
Money Crimes is a Crime House original powered by Pave Studios. New episodes release every Thursday. Just search for Money Crimes. That's MoneyCrimes. This episode of The Prosecutors is brought to you by Huggies Little Movers. Huggies knows that babies come in all shapes and sizes, and their tushies do too. Huggies Little Movers with its curved and stretchy fit. Moms know that there's nothing worse than an ill-fitting diaper, especially for your active babies. I love Huggies because I can rely on them to keep my baby covered while she moves around. You guys have heard about my sweet little baby. She just turned 1, deep into mobility. I am so excited about Huggies Little Movers because she can roll around, jump around, climb, which is everything she's doing. And I know that she is covered, and so am I in the cleanup.
And we all want the very best for our babies, and that's Huggies. Huggies Little Movers are curved, so babies feel comfy no matter how much they're moving around. And they're moving around a lot. They also offer up to 12-hour protection against leaks, which is a game changer. Get your baby's butt into Huggies Little Movers. We got you, baby.
And I agree, Brett. As a prosecutor, I don't know that there was much more they could do other than having Sheila flip to get Mike charged with anything. It seems incredibly clear that he had to have been behind it because of the ad, right? Like, why would Sheila take out an ad that was so misleading for someone else's company? It doesn't really make sense. They had to make sure that they were all in cahoots to have the right person answer the phone. And let me just say, love makes you do some crazy things, but they weren't even married. I don't know if there was some promise to get married later on when she committed this murder for Mike, right? We'll talk a little bit more about like why that is, because yes, of course, part of the motive was to remove the wife from the situation. But a lot of you are, followers of true crime and already thinking, what was there to gain for Mike from this? Was there something monetary? And while we don't have anything in the court of law admissible as evidence, we do have some interesting things that I think absolutely show there's no doubt that Mike knew about this, was part of it. He just wasn't the trigger puller, but he certainly benefited from this. So a couple things to discuss. We've already talked about how this is a clown murder and how strange you would go with a clown and know that Marlene wouldn't be scared of clowns and would open the door to a clown. Well, this isn't that surprising, and it wasn't a surprise to those who knew her. Marlene and her family, they loved clowns. And she loved painting clowns, and her parents have a room actually dedicated to clowns in their home, which features some of Marlene's paintings. So this wasn't a secret. And if you were a friend of hers, you might in fact buy her something clown-themed in order to surprise her. And so when she saw that clown, remember what she said, "Oh, how nice." Because in her mind, she's like, everyone knows I love clowns. My parents have a whole room dedicated to clowns. I paint clowns, and someone sent me a clown. That's so nice. So we know that anyone close to her, you don't even have to be that close to her, but certainly if you're married to her, lived with her, have ever been to her parents' house, like a husband would, you would know that clowns don't scare her. In fact, they would delight her. So much to the point that she would never think that someone behind that clown suit would wish any ill will on her. And then that brings us to before Marlene's death, her son, her younger son who witnessed this horrific murder of his mother, Joey Aarons, was charged with attempted murder when he was just 18 years old. Now, the details aren't really clear, but it seems like Joey was hanging out with a gang of guys when someone else's actions resulted in the charge. So it doesn't appear like the allegations are that Joey actually killed someone, but he was probably at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong guys, right? And because of these legal troubles, he had a lawyer, Christopher DeSantis. And Joey's lawyer, Christopher, recalled a very interesting story from his time representing Joey that actually didn't have to do with Joey at all. When they were leaving the courthouse for Joey's case, Mike Warren approached Christopher DeSantis and asked him, if a husband were to kill his wife, what would happen to her estate? It's pretty on the nose. I just have to say, as a lawyer, people do ask me these very direct questions sometimes. And I was like, we don't have an attorney-client privilege relationship going on right here. I would maybe try to ask that in a hypothetical or like, I'm asking for a friend.
But you can tell when he asked this question, he totally thought he could ask him and he could never say anything, right? Like you wouldn't ask that question to somebody unless you thought you had some sort of protection. because people don't really understand the attorney-client protection and the way it works. I mean, he's representing Joey. He's Joey's lawyer. Even if they're paying for it, this is another thing. Even if you're paying for somebody else's lawyer, the privilege is still between the client and the attorney, not the person paying and the attorney. So he asked this question probably thinking this guy could never repeat it. Not true.
Absolutely. And so DeSantis thought that this was just curiosity because, my goodness, most of us are not thinking that someone's asking that question because they're planning to kill their own wife. So DeSantis responds, it really isn't an issue of whether a man kills his wife. The question is whether the man is convicted of murdering his wife, because if he's convicted of murdering his wife, he wouldn't inherit. But if he were convicted of a lower charge, he would, it wouldn't really matter. And not only that, DeSantis went on, but if he had a friend who did it and they couldn't tie him as an accessory to the friend, then he'd get away scot-free. This is a very legalistic answer. And it's legally correct, right? This is more of like we're sitting around in law school, throwing around, hypothetical questions. This is what lawyers do. This is why lawyers are terrible. But he gave him advice, essentially, right? Not meaning to give advice, because that is the actually right answer. Doesn't matter if you kill him or not. It's whether you're convicted or not.
And look, maybe this lawyer is just lying because he wants to be in the middle of this story. I guess that's possible. But it is awfully remarkable that he tells this story, and what ends up happening. His wife is murdered, and not by him, by someone else, and he's never been tied to the crime. So whatever amount he did inherit, and recall, he had this business selling used cars. What did she have? She had this old rental portfolio she was managing. If they get divorced, that's going to be split in half. If you have the right judge might say, look, she poured herself into the rental properties. You poured yourself into the car company. The only reason you have the car company is because of investment from the rental properties. You're lucky to keep the car company. She gets the rental properties. Where the rental properties are where the real money is. She's the one who really built up this, where they would have this wealth that they enjoyed. So he's not going to want to divorce her. He wants to inherit that. And what does he do? He does. And like I said, there are limitations to the justice system, and there's simply not enough evidence to say definitively that he was involved in this. I know what I believe. I know what you believe out there, because you're all smart people. But convicting him in a court of law, doing it beyond a reasonable doubt, would be incredibly difficult. And so he's going to get away with this. To the extent he was involved, if he was involved, he's going to get away with it. He will not be convicted of it. And his lover, his mistress, who murdered his wife, is going to serve 7 years, 8 years in prison for that murder. And then she's going to get out as well. And then that money that Marlene was murdered for, they'll get to enjoy for the rest of their lives.
I mean, that money probably helped them buy the purple cow, right? That's exactly what it got them. It got them the purple cow that they ran. It got them their Lux retirement in Virginia. They have already lived an entire life off the backs of Marlene's murder. And even though there is a conviction, and thank God there is, because in a lot of these cases, especially if 27 years have passed, there's not even going to be a conviction. At least there is a conviction for Marlene's murder. But this is one of those unsatisfying cases in terms of the justice system having its limitations. And I don't think it's because of shoddy police work or anything like that. In fact, but for the police reopening the case and sending it off for DNA testing that took 3 years, there wouldn't even be justice in Marlene's case. But one thing you can do is to tell this story and to know all of the details of the case, because the truth is still out there. Whether there's you don't need a conviction in order to seek the truth in a case. And Marlene really seemed like a wonderful mother who was doing wonderful things for her family. And for her to meet an end like this in the cruelest of ways, literally at the hands of something she delighted in. Like, we made fun of clowns at the beginning of this, but like, so what? Whatever you enjoy, like you like puppies, you like kittens, you love kittens. Someone shows up at your door with a basket of kittens and pulls out a gun and shoots you in the face knowing that you love kittens. I mean, there is just something so deeply dark and evil about that. And that's what they did to Marlene. So that is the case. I don't think there's a mystery to it. And I'm glad there's not a mystery, because Marlene deserves the truth. And just remember that. Don't always look to the justice system for justice. There are other ways of justice. And one of those is speaking Marlene's story. And that's what we've done here. And thank you guys for, being a part of it and getting her story out there.
And I think that's absolutely right, Alice. This is a story that needs to be known for two reasons. Number one, because Marlene was a remarkable person who overcame a lot of adversity, tragedy in her life to make something out of her life and to be an impressive, wonderful person who was beloved by everyone who knew her. That's the first reason, because she deserves to be remembered that way. The second reason is because Mike and Sheila, Debbie, whatever she wants to call herself, they need to be remembered too. And everybody who runs into them needs to shun them. They need to be isolated. They need to be pariahs. They need to be looked at as murderers or someone who gave comfort to a murderer, whatever you think Mike's role is in this. As far as I know, he hadn't left Sheila. He hasn't condemned her. And if he takes her back when she gets out of prison after she's been convicted of murdering his wife, then he deserves whatever he gets as well. So people need to know that, and they need to treat them accordingly. Now, amazingly, this story I don't think is as well known as you would think it would be, given the details and the involvement of a clown. But there are lots of other resources if you guys are interested in this. We'll post a bunch of them on the website. I know Crime Weekly did coverage of this case. I'm sure it's fantastic. I haven't listened to it, but I'm sure it's great. There's also been several, I think Dateline did this, maybe 2020 as well. So there's a lot of different things you can watch if you want to learn more about this amazing case, and if you want to remember Marlene and her life and what these people did to her. Okay, well, I know that one probably blew your minds. We want to hear what you think. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, at prosecutorspod for all your social media. And join us on Patreon, and you can listen live and ad-free. And I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that by the time this is edited, this is going to seem like it was an incredibly smooth, just amazingly professional podcast experience. But if you were here watching it live as one of the 80 or so patrons, you saw something completely different. It
was one of the hottest messes you've ever experienced.
It is worth your $3 a month just to see how the sausage is made at times. So we want you guys to stick with us. But I do want to say farewell to the 20% of you who've looked at your calendar and realized that this episode is the last episode of September, which means next week is October. And you guys know what October means. It means Halloween.
Apparently not true crime.
Apparently not true crime.
I'm kidding.
Even though we're going to have plenty
it's all
of
true crime, y'all.
I'm already wearing a jack-o'-lantern sticker on my shirt. I'm ready to get into the action, even though it's still August as we record this. Halloween starts early with the podcast, so I'm really looking forward to it. We got some great cases. Once again, 5 Tuesdays in October this year, so 5 episodes of absolute true crime that will have some connection to the spooky season that will not necessarily be paranormal. Whatever it is that drives you people away, I'm telling you, it's going to be true crime. So come listen. We hope you guys will stick around. But for those of you who aren't, see you in November. Okay, Alice, do you want to answer a question before we sign off?
We better answer some questions because people aren't going to hear our voices for about 5 weeks.
That's true. Okay. This is from...
We'll answer double questions in October. How about that?
There you go. We'll answer all the good questions in October. Okay, Alice. This one is from Sam's Opinion. And Sam, I assume, wants to know, what sci-fi shows are you fans of? I don't know if... Did you watch sci-fi, Alice?
I have to think, because just like true crime, so much of it encompasses true crime or sci-fi that I never think of it as that genre until I really think about it. I was obsessed with singularities as a child. I don't know why. Was that a thing? Do you remember the book Singularity? I have no idea who wrote it. It was like a young adult novel that defined my childhood. And I want to say it was made into a TV show or a movie, but it's about black holes and singularities and what happens on the other side of them and that whole thing.
Did you watch the Disney movie, The Black Hole, when you were a kid?
I did not. Well, I'm probably going to go watch it now because black holes in general, space in general, it's not sci-fi, it's real sci, but it's like it might as well be sci-fi. You can't really think about it too much, or it kind of blows your mind, you know?
Okay, I know what other question we're going to answer, and I'm going to answer it, but I'll
Okay,
do that
I
in a
can't wait.
second. So,
Okay, what about you?
okay, so I like all kinds of sci-fi. I mean, obviously Star Wars, loved Star Wars growing up. As far as television shows, Star Trek, when I was a kid, The Next Generation was on. It was great. One show that I really liked that I feel like didn't get enough exposure was Babylon 5. Babylon 5 was just a great sci-fi it was sort of like sort of a Star Trek type thing, but it was set on a space station called Babylon 5. And it was supposed to be the last. It was so cool because every season had a different opening. And so it would open up and it would be like, the place is Babylon 5. It was the last hope for peace, right? And then it would like talk about how people met there and all this other stuff. Well, then in season 3, it opens up and it's like, Babylon 5 was the last hope for peace. It failed. And then and so it's just great, sort of epic sci-fi. So if you're into sci-fi and you haven't seen Babylon 5, definitely check it out. I think you'll like it. It was one of the ones I really liked. But I like a lot of sci-fi. I mean, Firefly was great. Like all that stuff.
I read a lot of
Serenity?
sci-fi. Yeah. I don't know that I watched that, but I also just don't watch a lot of TV. But I really do like reading sci-fi because it creeps me out.
Okay, so I saw this question. Let me see if I can find it.
Okay.
Because I want to answer it now. I've been waiting to answer it.
Oh,
'Cause
it's got to be good then.
It takes a minute to answer, but now with what you said, I feel like
okay. Now I'm really excited.
Now's probably the time.
Do we have like a creepy thing we both agree on for once?
Okay, see if I can get this right. Okay, so this is from Ray Misty 475877. I don't know what those numbers mean, but they say. So what's the theory that destroys math, Brett? I kind of think I agree. It's a human invention. Humans are flawed, yada, yada. But I thought since the West Memphis 3 hints, you might want someone to ask. And then also to Alice, is there any math field you find aesthetically pleasing? Like I always thought linear algebra looked cool because of the vectors. Okay. Do you want to answer what math
you go
like?
first.
Okay.
Because I love your answer to this. It's great.
Okay. So here's the thing. When I was in high school, and I think it was Algebra 2. I forget where limits are introduced into math, but you learn about basically numbers that approach another number but never touch the number. So if you've seen Mean Girls, for instance, I think the last question
the limit does not exist
is what is the limit of this equation? The limit doesn't exist, right? So you have these, I think they're called asymptotes, which is like the line that they approach but they never touch it. And as I was a nerdy child, teenager or whatever, I used to play around with this. And one thing that I always noticed was that if you divide by a number, the bigger the number gets, the higher the line goes. And so, for instance, to explain what I mean by this. So 2 divided by 1 is 2, right? 2 divided by 0.1, though, is 20. Right? And 2 divided by 0.001 or 0.01 is 200. So the lower that number gets on the bottom, the higher the number goes, right? So if you graph this on a chart, you see that the lower the number gets, the higher the curve is going. And the curve is going higher and higher as the number at the bottom approaches 0, right? So now, what is something that you all learned in math? What is a number divided by 0?
Nothing. You can't do it.
You can't do it. It's undefined, right? That's what they tell you. That's what they tell you in
This
math.
is the lie.
But in reality, if you think about it, the lower that number gets, the higher the other number is going. And so what it should be is infinity. Infinity. So as you go higher, it
your
should
math
be infinity.
problem here.
But that's not what math tells you. What math tells you is you can't do it. It's undefined. Why is that? It doesn't make any sense. And it's never made any sense.
But isn't infinity also undefined? Like the definition of infinity is actually that it's undefined?
So
sorry,
here's
I'm
what's
ruining your
fascinating.
model.
Here's what's fascinating about this and what ties back to what Alice said. And this is why, if you think about it, math falls apart. At this point, dividing by zero, math falls apart. And with it, everything that is built on that, physics, everything falls apart when you divide by zero. Let's talk about Einstein. So Einstein, back in the 20s, actually before the 20s, he is thinking about gravity. He's thinking about gravity and how gravity works. And under Newtonian physics, gravity is attraction between large objects. So the sun's really big, and so it attracts all the planets, and they go around the sun. And the Earth is bigger than the moon, so the moon is attracted to the Earth, and it goes around the Earth, and we are attracted to the Earth and everything else, right? And it makes sense, and it works. This is what's amazing about physics. That idea works perfectly in 99% of the situations you're ever going to be in. But there was a problem with it, and that was, how does gravity work across large distances? How can it be that this force is exerted over large distances? And even Newton said, you got me. Like, I have no idea, right? And basically said, look, there is a problem here. There's a problem in my own physics that I can't explain. And for hundreds of years, no one could explain it, and people tried different things, but they couldn't explain it. Then Einstein comes along, and he changes fundamentally the way we look at gravity. And he says, look, it's not an attraction, it's space itself being folded by large masses. So the sun is creating this massive distortion in space, and that distortion causes everything that's traveling to go around the sun, because essentially it's trying to travel in a straight line, but because of this massive dispersion, it goes around, right? It curves. It causes objects to curve. And so that's how space and time and gravity works. So Einstein came up with these really complicated equations, these field equations to describe gravity. They're really complicated. And he sends them out to all his sort of physicist friends, and to say, hey, this is my theory, this is what I think, can you solve these really complicated equations? And one ends up, and I forget which scientist it was, but he's like in the German army at the time, like helping them aim their artillery, which, just imagine, you got a guy who's like that brilliant, he's helping them aim artillery. You can bet they didn't miss with their artillery that often. And he gets Einstein's equation. So one day when he's not, firing off artillery in World War I, he's thinking about this equation. And what he does is he sits down and he thinks about, let me do the simplest thing I can do. Because really, when you get into these complex math ideas, it really all becomes philosophy. So he sits down and he thinks about, okay, what if I had a point in space that has no diameter, nothing like that? How would that work in this whole equation? So its diameter is 0 because it's a point in space. And he fills out this whole equation and it works. But there's a problem. There's a problem. Because when he does the field equation, there are two places in the equation where he ends up, because of the way he's defined this point in space, dividing by 0, which, undefined, right? But what he realizes is what that means is at that point in space, when you divide by 0, the mass there and the effect on gravity would be infinite. And what is that when you have an infinite effect on gravity at a singular point in space?
A singularity. A black hole.
A singularity. A black hole. So at the end of the day...
It's Leibniz, by the way. The mathematician is
Was
Leibniz.
it Leibniz? Okay.
Yes.
There you go. Dividing by 0 is what gives you a black hole,
Infinity!
which is something so bizarre that for a long time people didn't even think they existed. They thought this was a flaw. This was a flaw in Einstein's thing. In fact, I think, what was the name of the guy who was disabled? And Stephen Hawking. He initially didn't think black holes could exist, and they had like a bet, and then eventually they decided, nope, they absolutely exist. In fact, they're the center of every galaxy. So all of math, all of physics tells you that this can't happen, and when it does happen, it's that point, that universe destroying point of the singularity. So that's the ultimate destruction of math.
So is it that math never caught up? It's not that math gets destroyed. First of all, that was brilliant. I hope all of you listen to that and rewind it and listen to it again. Brett's coming out with his new Math Folds Physics Science podcast, coming out soon to a podcast platform near nobody. But is it that infinity does exist. Okay, because no one quite knows what a black hole is, because you can't go into a black hole and survive. And it is, the reason it's black is because it literally sucks in all energy that no light can escape, and that's why it's black, right? Black is not a color; it's the absence of light. So it's not that asymptotes are messed up. It's that math never caught up to Leibniz's point, that it was so massive, and maybe because it's such a massive concept that all the brains of all like students studying math, their brains would just get crushed like a singularity if they ever were to think about it as something other than undefined. So undefined is actually a concept which suspends reality so that we can learn math and not be crushed by the weight of reality. That's what it is. We all live in a suspended reality because our overlords don't think we can handle the truth. You can't handle the truth, Brett.
No, I mean, that's right. I love it. I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, there is.
I just theorized away your actual math problem.
At the singularity, everything there is. You know, the singularity is this. It is incomprehensible. Like, you
go
can't
read about. If you don't know,
comprehend
I'm still obsessed with singularities as an adult. If you don't know what a singularity, like really understand, go check out a science book about singularities, and your mind will be blown. It will be the most interesting thing I think you'll ever learn about in your entire life. It will shape how you view the entire universe. And also, I think I'm kind of joking about the theorizing about how our brains would explode because we can't understand asymptotes versus infinity. But I kind of think that might be part of it, because we know for a fact that we can only give our brains so much to accomplish. So maybe like the smartest of the smarts, the Leibnizes, the Newtons, the Hawkings, they were like, you know what? The average human being, even with a very high IQ, cannot. Their brains will literally collapse with the weight, like a black hole, with the weight of the knowledge of true math, that we need to save humankind from the weight of knowledge. So we will call it undefined, because undefined can cover so many sins.
Yeah, I mean, you hear undefined and you just say, "Oh, okay, I'm not even think about that. I'm not
Move
gonna worry
on.
about that. Move
it's
on.
just a
Can't
zero
do
with
that."
a dash across
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. You know, it's just amazing. You think about the fact that we put people on the moon with imaginary numbers, right? I mean, you had a situation
Literally.
we could not figure out. Like, how do you have the square root of a negative number? I don't know. You know, the square root of 4 is 2. What's the square root of negative 4? 2 times an imaginary number that we can't even comprehend. But you plug that into all the formulas, and all of a sudden, you know, you're landing on the moon.
And that is one of the most bizarre things. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, I studied math for a long time. I thought I was going to do math for a living. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, you like math because it's definitive, right? There are equations and there are answers, and there's only one way to do things. Unlike the theories that we espouse all the time in law, where we can get a million different rationalizations to get to the same point. That is highly annoying to a lot of people. But everyone says the good thing about science and math is there's a defined set of steps you take, and there's one right answer. I think that's a concept too. I think that's an absolute concept because of exactly what you say. When you run into those particular problems, and you have to get to like incredibly high level problems where there can be unsolvable equations, right? We see this all the time in like the NASA movies. They're like, we can't solve this equation, and it takes years, and, you know, usually women who solve the problems. And it takes that long because there actually are these concepts that are beyond our conceptual thinking, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. And I also don't think there's just one way to get there. But I'm not going to be the one to test it when we're sending someone to the moon.
Yeah, and, you know, it's one of those things. It's like Newton's physics. Newton's physics, his equations work on Earth. Like, you can use Newtonian physics to do just about anything on Earth, and you don't have to worry about it. You're not going to mess up. Plane's going to land. Everything's going to be fine. You know, but once you get beyond that, then everything starts to fall apart. And frankly, all of our science is like that. Like, we have a very low level understanding of the way everything works. And then the closer you get,
Like time.
Like
time.
time.
Truly is a construct. Right? Like, I mean, when you were saying like time folds, like literally it is a construct. All these movies, these sci-fi movies about like if you go to a different planet and you age faster or you age slower because of the way time is a construct, because it is absolutely, it's all time, energy, light. The fact that the things you take as every day that work on Earth just don't exist. Like my 6-year-old gets this and I don't even get it because his brain is not yet molded by like, you know, rationality.
Well,
he understands that time is a concept.
it's like you mentioned light. You know, light, if you don't look at
The
it,
fact that light can bend.
yeah, if you don't look at it, it travels like a wave. But if you look at it, it travels like a particle. Okay. Like, that's weird, right? Like, why is that? Nobody knows. It's just, I don't know. Like, the whole thing is light. One particle of light can do two different things at the same time. In fact,
Right.
there's one experiment where
And then
you
it can
actually
exist apart from its source for essentially infinity.
right.
That is insane. What other thing can exist separate from its source for essentially eternity?
There's
light.
There's one experiment with light that, and we'll just need to do like a whole episode on this, where depending on how you measure it, it can change what it did in the past. So it had to go a certain way to get to where it's going, but then if you measure it in a certain way, the past will change. The direction that it went in the past will change for the purposes of that experiment.
I mean, just look at the stars. The stars you are looking at no longer exist, yet they are only now entering into the reality of your eyes, though they have long since burnt out in the state at which you view them. What? I mean, that's just like a very real example of like, look up at the night sky today. None of that exists. But it does, because those particles are just now entering your eyesight, but they are from millions of years ago. Anyways, this has nothing to do with true crime whatsoever, but that was a great question.
Welcome to October, everybody.
Don't leave us.
It's gonna be math episodes for the next month. If math terrified you in high school, just wait till October. Okay.
Well, this has been fun.
This has been fun. All right, guys.
We just spent more time on math than we did on theories in this case.
It's true.
I just want to
kind of
put that
did
out there.
because we know who did
Talking
it.
about the relativity of time.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe one day we'll be able to go back in time and see who all committed all these crimes. But I think we know in this case exactly who did it without the benefit
who did it in this case.
of time travel. All right, y'all been awesome. Thanks for sticking with us. If you have any other math questions, thoughts, theories you want us to discuss, let us know. Otherwise, we'll try and stick to true crime, though, as I said, with a Halloween bent for at least the next 5 weeks. All right, Alice, I'd ask you if you had anything else to say, but I'm afraid where you might go. So instead, I'll just say we'll see you guys next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
You dive into the story. People are complaining about my new setup, so I'm going to try to turn my camera around while you go, but I'm going to be on mute. You go for it.
You guys need to quit complaining about her setup.
Look,
Here's Alice.
you
She's
know
doing
what?
all
You
she
guys
can.
Don't hate on. They just want a beautiful viewing scenery, and I can't always.
Not
give
all
it to
of
them.
us. Not all of us
I barely
can have
made it here tonight. I'm just happy to be here.
a beautiful Clue Award just right over our shoulder. Not everyone can have
I can't.
that kind of decoration. So maybe you
October's
guys
coming.
should
The
go
October
easier
heist is coming.
on her. Yeah.
Tell people this story. Tell people the story.
It's your turn.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. Something popped up on my screen and I couldn't see anything. I'm sorry. Everything went blank. Okay, I'm still here. Woo!
Okay.
Pluto TV is a place for movie fans, like me.
And TV fans, like me.
They've got something for everyone, and it's free.
I love free, and I love Jersey Shore.
For me, it's The Godfather.
SpongeBob SquarePants, I am Patrick. Patrick is me.
Oh, Forrest Gump, come on.
Criminal Minds, solving crime after bedtime.
Whatever you love to watch, Pluto TV makes it easy with thousands of free movies and shows.
Pluto TV, stream now, pay never.